All right. Well, thank you to the Protocol Labs team for having us here. Super excited to be here. Hope everyone's been having a great time at South by Southwest and at the Sustainable Blockchain Summit in particular. So my name is Osho. I'm here to talk to you about dClimate, which is an open ecosystem for creating climate apps. I'm one of the founding partners. And basically, we're looking to solve a lot of problems around climate data. And the reason we think this is important is because in order to build next-gen climate tech products and climate analytics, we need to have better, easier to use data. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do, how we do it, how we work with Fallcoin. But before I go into dClimate, I'm going to rewind a little bit to tell you how we discovered that this problem even exists. So I helped co-found another company called Arbol, and that's in the parametric insurance space, which is basically just a fancy way of saying data-driven insurance. So instead of filling out a ton of forms, we deal with just data, and we specifically insure climate events. So a company such as a Texas utility company might come to us and say, hey, we're worried about snowfall this year, or we're worried about really cold winter this year, so we would like to get covered from January through March for any inclement, like extremely low temperatures that are below the 5, 10, whatever your average they choose. We track that data, and if this event happens, we give them a payout. There's no questions asked, it's all done on data. And so we built this platform using Ethereum smart contracts, and we plug into traditional fiat rails for the clients that want that. We plug into crypto rails for the clients that want to do that. But all of this can be decentralized and is in the process of being decentralized. Now, in order to build these products, we have to have a lot of data. And it's been cool because as we've grown there, we've seen a lot of different industries make use of our products. So originally we started out with weather and agriculture, right? Because there's an intuitive relationship right there. And we found that agribusinesses had a lot of use case for our product. But that same heat data that goes into tracking the progress of a corn harvest, for example, is the same heat data that a power plant wants to track a summer heat wave with, right? So you can see how this extends. And the real key here is that we do it in a hyper-local fashion. So that's where, I'm the chief data scientist there, so that's where we kind of ran into the first problem with climate data, which is, it is really hard to work with. And on this slide, we have basically our mandate, which is how are we gonna make it easier to work with? And on this next slide here, we have some of the problems that we ran into. So just to keep it really straightforward, you have anything from esoteric file formats, you have data sets that have no real documentation and or 140 pages of .txt documentation that you're digging through to just find units. What geographic range does it cover? What is the resolution of this data set? That's actually where the domain of climate data does get very interesting. You have so many government agencies across the world collecting this data, as well as nonprofits, as well as academic institutions. But because they're collecting it for their own purposes, everyone follows a different methodology. And you have some data sets that have very high resolution, but only cover like the United States. You have bigger resolution, but they cover the whole world. And then you have some really weird ones that like only deal with ocean or only deal with certain parts of a country, like stuff like that, right? So going back to the product side, we needed to start, consolidating all this data in order to make our product development easier. And we did that for about 3 years, and the product traction grew. We started going into more and more industries and started collecting more data. And what we realized is we are sitting on a treasure trove of climate data, and we should not keep this in-house. This was publicly available data to begin with, and we don't believe in creating moats by charging people for data that was originally free. That's a very, in my opinion, Web 2 mentality. So we decided, let's open source this into dClimate, and let's create an open ecosystem, because if you make the data easy to work with, anyone can start building apps, and anyone can build products that can trace the data over time. And we had a bunch of speakers here today talk about various aspects, such as like reforestation, carbon offsets, tracking miner, carbon footprint. Like, we look at all this and we think it's awesome, and to have the data behind that to track as these things change is very important. So our flagship product, which is currently in a security audit, is the data marketplace, right? So why do we choose a marketplace approach? Well, we work with a lot of free data because it can be agreed upon, and that's helpful for insurance. That's our main kind of business, so that's where our thought process is. But there are a lot of vendors in the space as well. And there's this bigger problem of how do you find the data that you need to work with, right? So I've been a data scientist for 10 plus years. I spent a majority of that time working with large unstructured data sets to basically mine them for alpha to trade various markets. And to be honest with you, working with climate data has been the biggest challenge and the most difficult challenge that I've taken on. It's just really hard. It's kind of hard to even find what data you need. Now, I'm lucky. Like, I work at a tech company where we have the resources to deal with incredible large amounts of data. I also have 2 meteorologists on my team that, if I ask them, like, what's the best data set to track rainfall in Berlin? They know this off the top of their head because they were doing research in this stuff. What's the best data for tracking forecasts on a 15-minute basis in the Midwest in the US? They know where to go, right? But not everyone has access to that. So the reason we decided to start with a marketplace is because it's a way of indexing and organizing the world's climate data, right? So when I say index and organize, the first kind of company that comes to mind is a company like Google, because they're indexing and organizing the world, but or the entire web. But the thing is, the web is a very broad domain. And so in a very specific domain, I actually look to something like iTunes as a great example of how a marketplace is able to index and organize data. In this case, apps. In our case, it's climate data. So we want to make it accessible for anyone to work with. And we are actually focusing on doing this without requiring any particular like crypto payments or anything like that, because the majority of the companies don't want to deal with stuff like that. So we also have a bunch of other projects going on, and a couple of these have been released, and one of them is a sneak peek. The idea here is that we can build all sorts of analytics on top of climate data that can then be monetized, and therefore we don't have to monetize the base data itself, and we can continue to allow it to live for free. So over there on the left, you have a screenshot of a game that we built called Storm Brokers. Storm Brokers is basically like Monopoly, except storms can come break your house, and it uses both historical and simulated hurricane data to do that, right? This is a fun little thing because one of our colleagues is really into indie games, so him and his crew put this together, and it's a great showcase of climate data stuff that's not as grim as the usual subjects around climate data, but it also has an interesting alternative, right? Because we can put a prize pool around there and use this to incentivize and gamify forecasting, right? So some fun things coming from there. On the right-hand side, that's a sneak peek of next-gen carbon offset that's all data-driven that we are hoping to launch in the next month or so. And then front and center is Worksite. So Worksite is a particularly cool example, right? The world's largest construction company came to us to basically ask, how do we assess our construction risk, right? And what we discovered in the process, and this is kind of crazy to me, is that the largest construction projects in the world don't have a way to figure out how many days of missed work they're going to have due to inclement weather. So you have construction managers working on, these skyscrapers or even residential buildings, and they're Googling things like average temperature in July in New York City to understand, how many days are they going to have to shut down their work site. So by taking the available data and giving them a platform where they can then put in the thresholds that they know shut down business, they can see that, okay, I'm gonna have 10 missed days during this cycle, or I'm gonna have 100 missed days, something like that. So that's a simple example of how analytics are not only helpful on the industrial side, but how the current infrastructure doesn't really have a lot of this tooling available, and people are kind of left in the dark, right? One of the things that we kind of talk about a lot at work is how you can't solve problems unless you can measure them and understand them, right? And I feel like a lot of these simple tools that we build help with that, but on the flip side, it's kind of crazy to me that people are flying blind, if you will. So we have a relatively complicated software stack, and IPFS and Fallcoin play a big role in that. So we started, that's right. So we started by managing our own IPFS clusters, and in the future we will be moving to Filecoin Estuary. So we have terabytes and terabytes of data on IPFS, right? And part of this was because if we go back to Arbol, the whole idea was how do we decentralize the whole climate insurance process, right? Well, first step, you have to decentralize the data. But what we learned in developing this IPFS infrastructure is that actually there's a lot of properties to IPFS that make it particularly helpful for climate data. For example, if you have a weather station and they change a sensor on that, they have to go change data in the past. But they don't send you an email telling you that, right? So now you're seeing numbers that change. And that's where the immutability is really helpful. You can go point in time and see what data said at any given time, right? There's also a very important use case around redundancy. So the important thing here is that while our governance runs on Ethereum, it's all open source otherwise and can be implemented by other blockchains and can be implemented by even Web 2. Our API gets about 1 million requests a month and is used by a lot of insurers, a lot of hedge funds, things like that. Anyone who basically wants to work with climate data, and that's been working in stealth mode. So anyone here building climate apps, I invite you to do that. I talked a little bit about the importance of Fallcoin in our ecosystem. It's only going to get more and more important. Estuary is an incredibly important tool for what we're building and will help us handle the scale of climate data that we're trying to work with. And then I want to talk a little bit about why blockchain is important in this problem. So blockchains are inherently really good at valuing public goods. It started with open source software. Open source software was originally seen as kind of a hobbyist thing or like a lifelong dedication that you made at the expense of commercial profits. Blockchain kind of turned that on its head. It provided an incentivization layer for open source software that allowed people to engage with protocols and make the development of open source software profitable. We think it can do the same thing with climate data. We think it can do the same thing with climate apps in general. The traceability and verifiability is definitely important. You can track changes over time. This is crucial for any sort of ESG analysis. That's obviously a hot topic for a lot of corporations. So when the Monsantos of the world say that, they're not going to engage in monocropping, how do we track that? When a certain, oil company says that they're not going to drill in a certain area, how do we track that? How do we track deforestation? And then lastly is blockchain helps us reach a few of our goals, which are around accessibility of data by basically making it easier. That's that marketplace infrastructure, that API infrastructure, aligning all this data. The availability of data, there's a lot of places in the world where there isn't great data collection. This is both the case within the US as well as in other countries. So later this year, we're launching our IoT program, which is in beta mode right now, where users will essentially be incentivized to mine their local weather data. And it's a great way to build essentially the world's largest weather station network. It's a small goal for 2022 for us. And then the last part, and I touched on it with the verifiability, is the accountability aspect, right? Especially with this ESG. If we cannot track the data, then we can never really hold the changes accountable. And that goes back to what I said earlier, which is you cannot solve a problem unless you can measure it and understand it. So that's my little talk here. Got about 2 minutes if anyone wants to ask questions. Thank you. Also, we have these on socks, so very exciting stuff going on, and we'll have some new little climate critters coming out. Any questions? Yeah, go for it. Thanks for not leaving me hanging.
Just sort of wondering, so we have sort of, Web3 storage and measurement. We have the incentive mechanisms, and sort of an unfair question to levy onto you, but sort of everybody else who's presented and so forth. Like, what are your thoughts around Web3 accountability and making sure that, the shit actually gets done, and like you're not paying for projects which then, the trees get harvested or whatever?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The accountability comes in two aspects, right? With respect to projects getting done, reforestation, that kind of stuff, that goes back to climate data as a whole. And the way we track our world. So climate data is a very rich domain. NASA's constantly launching satellites, the Japanese Space Agency is launching satellites. We can see how forests are changing over time, and that resolution is only getting better. the general Web3 accountability of, is dClimate solving the problem that it set out to solve? I would optimistically like to say yes, and I would optimistically like to say most Web3 companies are. There's a lot of good intentions, a lot of great effort, and a lot of smart people working in this space. So I think things should work out really well. But in the case of dClimate, just based on the usage and the traction we've seen from industrial use cases, we think that this is just the beginning of releasing tons of products. And I do think the future of DAOs is very much multi-product rather than a single product. Yeah.
I'm curious. Thank you so much. I was wondering, with a lot of the sort of climate blockchain applications, a big concern is the GIGO problem, like sort of garbage in, garbage out when it comes to data. I'm just curious how you guys are thinking about that problem, because obviously a lot of your data inputs are coming from industry. Is that standardized across different sectors, right? They might report differently. Like, how do you account for those? How do you account for that variability?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we focus on time series data, and in particular, we look to index data by location and time, which is why we work with a lot of government agency data, like the NOAAs of the world, or BOM, which is the Australian, weather station network. So there we can be very confident that the input data is good and at least agreed upon because all industry participants are using that. We tend to stay away from a lot of self-reported data because the whole goal is to use objective data to track these problems. I think the other way we solve the GIGO problem is, there are kind of companies in this climate space that will do things like clean and fill data, like any missing data from weather stations, but they'll charge you hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. We give that all out for free. We use AI mechanisms to do all that clean and fill. And by giving this out for free, people can build these better apps. So that's the better input. And the IoT program is another input into that, right? How do we get hyper-localized collection? That only makes it even more direct to communities and locations. Yeah.
The IoT program, do you see like producers being able to monetize and like, because the marketplace is there, it's all free for now, but do you see there being like a way for people to sell their own data?
Yeah, we have no problem with charging for data so long as it's unique data. I think it's like unfair to take government data and then, we do a lot of work to it, but it's unfair to just like charge people for that. I think we get better outcomes when we allow people to build with that. And it's also a better challenge for us, right? Like, why create a kind of boring artificial moat when we can just create better products? In the case of the IoT program data, this is so localized, and we are essentially paying people to mine their local data, or that's what we're going to be doing, that monetizing that data makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
If no one else has any questions, I have two.
Sure, go ahead.
Real quick. We are setting up for our last conversation.
All right, cool.
We've got a few more. So you talked about all the opportunities, all the applications that can be built. Sounds like that opportunity landscape is very rich.
Yeah.
But I want you to fast forward real quick to 5-10 years out from now. And you all have already achieved everything you've set out to achieve with dClimate, created this unbelievable repository of climate-related data, decentralized. There's tons of applications about it, residing on top of all that data. What is that one opportunity that you are most keen to tackle and seems like the hardest one to tackle?
Yeah, so I guess for me it would be the carbon product. So that was the sneak peek that we have. I think preventing deforestation is an incredibly important part of the climate problem. It's incredibly personal to me as well. One of the reasons I even moved to America as a kid is because my dad was studying sustainable development. How do we basically work with communities to prevent deforestation and essentially teach them that this ultimately harms them? So he came to the US to do his PhD in that, so that's how I ended up here to begin with. So growing up, we always had conversations about deforestation and the environment in general, so for me that's a big one. I think we have a real shot at cracking that problem. And I think blockchain plays a very important role there because you can align incentives and essentially pay people to stop cutting down trees, right? I saw that mentioned in an earlier slide, and it really, it's something we think about a lot as well. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that's fantastic. To my second question, closing question. Where do I get those socks?
Should hit up Robbie. Okay. Robbie's our head of comms there. Awesome. He actually gave me a sneak peek of a limited edition drop that he's doing with a different climate critter on there. We're thinking of maybe starting to sell merch with all the proceeds going to various kind of environmental foundations and stuff. So he's working on that. We have him working on a ton of stuff. So we'll see when he gets to it. But yeah, hit him up, DM him. He'll send you a pair.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Osho.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
For sure.